Hello and welcome to another one of Mr. Beckstrom's AP Microecon content review videos. This one's from Unit 1. I'll be reviewing the concepts of absolute and comparative advantage and then doing a little bit of practice to solve a comparative advantage question like you might be asked on the AP test. So first of all, let's review this idea of per unit opportunity cost. We need to be able to find per unit opportunity cost in order to figure out comparative advantage between two potential trading partners. So it's actually quite simple. It's just the opportunity cost divided by the number of units gained. For example, if it costs $50 to produce 5 shirts, the per unit cost for each shirt is $10. What we want to do, though, is to take money out of the question, and instead of money, think of it as hats. So you could produce 10 hats or 5 shirts. What's the cost of each hat? What's the cost of each shirt? The math there is quite simple. One shirt costs 2 hats. One hat costs half a shirt. So let's apply this to two different trading partners. Let's take this funny example of Ronald McDonald and Papa John. So if Ronald can produce 20 pizzas or 200 burgers, Papa John can produce 100 pizzas or 200 burgers, then calculate the per unit opportunity cost for each good for each party. It's a very simple fraction. So for Ronald, one pizza costs 10 burgers, and one burger costs 1/10 of a pizza. And for Papa, one pizza costs 2 burgers, and one burger costs half of a pizza. So as you can see, Ronald has comparative advantage in the production of burgers because it costs him only 1/10 of a pizza to produce a burger, whereas Papa has comparative advantage in the production of pizzas because one pizza only costs 2 burgers, whereas it costs Ronald 10. So absolute advantage is actually the much simpler cousin of comparative advantage. Absolute advantage is just find the bigger number and point to it, which can produce the most. In this case, neither had absolute advantage in the production of burgers because both Ronald and Papa could produce 200 burgers, as we can see back here in our example. But Papa clearly has the absolute advantage in the production of pizza. Because Papa can produce 100 pizzas, whereas Ronald only 20. Comparative advantage can be found in a question like this, even though neither one of the parties has the only absolute advantage. So absolute and comparative advantage do not necessarily always go together, as you'll see in just a moment in the next example. So talking a little bit about applying this concept to specialization and trade. If you take this idea of specialization and trade and look at a more realistic example of the USA and Brazil. So let's say the United States can make 30 tons of sugar and 30 tons of wheat in a given time period. Brazil, 20 and 10 respectively. For the United States, it's very clear that 1 ton of wheat costs 1 ton of sugar, and 1 ton of sugar costs 1 ton of wheat. For Brazil, the math is ever so slightly more complicated. 1 ton of sugar costs half a ton of wheat, and 1 ton of wheat costs 2 tons of sugar. So you can probably already envision what the comparative advantage is going to look like. The United States has comparative advantage in wheat. And the United States might specialize and trade in wheat, and Brazil has comparative advantage in sugar and specialize and trade sugar. We'll talk about terms of trade in just a moment when we get back to this example, but right now, let's set this problem up. So what you'll see here is the most common way that comparative advantage questions are broken down. If you were to write this question out, or you to be working on this on the AP test, you want to write the values. You see I've written the values close to the left-hand side of the box, so that right next to each one of those values, I can write the per unit opportunity cost of that good. So wheat in the United States costs 1 sugar. Sugar in the United States, each one costs 1 wheat. For Brazil, it looks like that. Each wheat in Brazil costs 2 sugar. Each sugar in Brazil costs half of a wheat. So United States, comparative advantage in wheat. Brazil, comparative advantage in sugar. Like that. Just look in the good column. So after you calculate with those simple fractions, look at each good. So in wheat, which one has the lower cost for wheat? United States, because it only costs 1 sugar. Which one has the lower cost for sugar? Brazil, because it only costs only costs half of a wheat. These answers to these questions should be fairly simple and straightforward. The United States should export wheat, Brazil should export sugar and import wheat. Now, here's something that's very interesting. This is a graphical representation of gains from trade on a PPC problem. I haven't seen this appear very frequently on the AP test, though it might pop up this year in 2020, since the FRQ questions is all they're asking, and they're probably going to be a little bit harder. So we'll see. So what we can see here is trade shifts the PPC. The United States, remember, the United States had comparative advantage in wheat. So the United States makes all wheat and trades it. Over here, Brazil had comparative advantage in sugar. Brazil only makes sugar. They make 20 tons of sugar and 0 tons of wheat because they leave the wheat making to the United States. The slide earlier, I actually had the terms of trade listed. So the terms of trade here would be anything in between those two values in either column. So to determine terms of trade, as I did in the slide that shows the shifted PPCs, what I did was I looked at the wheat column and I said, well, in the United States, a wheat is worth 1 sugar. In Brazil, a wheat is worth 2 sugars. For a wheat to trade between the two, a wheat should be worth somewhere between 1 and 2 sugars. So I took the easy answer of 1.5 to split the difference. So if 1 wheat is worth 1.5 sugars, the United States produces 30 30 tons of wheat domestically. If they were to trade all 30 tons for sugar, they would be able to then acquire 45 tons of sugar on the market, more sugar than they could have made for themselves. The same is true over here for Brazil. If the Brazil produces all sugar and they trade those sugars in, 1.5 sugars per wheat, they're able to get close to 15 tons of wheat. So each PPC shifts out. Notice that the point of specialization, so 30 tons of wheat for the United States, that doesn't move, but the PPC kind of swings out. And the area underneath this blue PPC for both countries is an area of consumption that they can get to only with trade. They would not have been able to consume any of those bundles before trade, so there's a nice graphical representation of gains from trade. The next couple of slides will show us some practice questions, and the last thing for this review video is to tell the difference between an output question and an input question, because it changes the math on you ever so slightly. So here's an example of what we call an output question. In this case, we see the number of units of compact discs and units of beef that can be created in produced in 2 different countries, Japan and Canada. Japan can produce 4 units of CDs and 2 units of beef. Canada, 4 units of CDs and 6 units of beef. In this case, to find the relative per unit opportunity cost, since these are units of product, we know it's an output question. The setup to the question also helps us determine this. The following chart illustrates the number of CDs and pounds of beef that can be produced in 1 hour. So this is number of units produced. Okay, so number of units produced is an output. So we know that this is an output question. And for an output question, the other goes over. What's that mean? So what's the cost of CDs in Japan? The other, which is the number of units of beef Japan can produce, goes over. So CDs cost 2/4 of a beef in Japan, or excuse me, half a beef. So each CD costs half a beef. Over in Canada, each CD costs 6/4 of a beef, or as you can simplify, 1 1/3 beef. So CDs in Canada cost 1 1/3 beef. CDs in Japan cost half a beef. So you can see that Japan has comparative advantage in CDs, even though Canada can make just as many CDs as Japan. You can pause the video here to finish working out this question before I go over an input method question. Here's an input method question. The following chart illustrates the number of hours. Number of hours is a factor of production. It's labor time. So this can be tricky if you just look straight at the table and don't read the setup to the table. Then you could miss the fact that this is units of input rather than units of output. If these are units of input, all you do is do the first step with the fraction backwards. So how much does bread cost in the United States? Instead of putting 2 over 4, you put 2 under 4. Input question, other goes under. Put 2 under 4. Bread costs 4 halves of a corn, or bread costs 2 corn in the United States. In France, bread costs 2/3 of a corn. And to find the opposite, you just flip the fraction over. How much does corn cost in the United States? 2/4 of a bread, or half a bread. How much does corn cost in France? 6/4 of a bread, or 1 1/3 bread. That's it for the concept review today. Make sure that you don't get fooled by those input and output questions. Last piece on the output question, input question idea is that they often ask more output questions than input questions. So if all you see is a chart or a table that looks like this, then you can assume it's an output question. But if there's any text, you always have to read all that text very carefully. It's why you get the extra reading time on the AP test. Read all the text carefully, and it will clue you in to how to answer that question. Remember, the content's not that hard, so they always try to trick you with input question, output question, asking you about various traps and things like that. So like the lump sum trap that I'll cover in a different video. Anyhow, thank you very much for watching. Good luck on the AP test. I'll talk to you soon.